Okay, guys, we're live.
Okay, Bula, Talofa Lava, bonjour. Welcome everyone to our session on how we can better use data and traditional knowledge to make decisions that affect nature. I will be your host for this session. My name is Stacy Jupiter. I'm the Melanesia Regional Director with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and it's very nice to be here with you all spread across the Pacific and around the world to have this conversation. So I just wanted to give everyone an introduction to the format of this session. We decided that everyone probably by this point in the first day was maybe getting a little tired of PowerPoint presentations. And so we decided to have a moderated panel session. So we'll be asking some questions around 4 topics, and I'll introduce those topics in a second, and then we'll open it up for public audience question and answer as well to our speakers. So the 4 topics that we'll be talking about during the session today are, first of all, the role of targets and indicators in framing information gathered for decision making regarding how nature is used in. Our second topic will be around issues about information availability and quality. Our third topic will discuss the range of data platforms and tools for aggregating, housing, and making sense of scientific data and traditional knowledge. And our fourth topic will talk about how decisions are actually made that impact Pacific biodiversity and ecosystem, and what sorts of information, if any, are decision makers using. And while we wanted to get speakers from the government on our panel in this session, we weren't able to. So I do encourage, if any of you out there in the audience are from Pacific Island governments, to please chime in when we get to that 4th session and offer your opinion about what data is important for you for decision making. But now I do want to introduce our panel speakers for this session. So today, responding to the questions, we have Paul Anderson with us. Paul is the Inform Project Manager with SPREC, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. We have Tiffany Straza, who is the lead author of the SOECO, State of Environment and Conservation in Oceania report, and she was also the deputy editor of the UNESCO Science Report. And we have Sebastian Lagarde, who is a GIS ninja, which I'm really excited to hear about, working for the company called Insight. And they will be taking our questions today. So we're going to go to the first topic, but for every single one of these topics, we're going to start each of these mini topics with a poll question for our audience. So I encourage you to respond to the poll. And the first question for our first topic is, how often do you refer to information in the SOCO reports when planning new projects or programs? Never, rarely, occasionally, sometimes, or regularly. And you can find the poll in your feed there and put your answer, and we'll come back and maybe have a little bit of a discussion on the response after our panelists talk about the questions. So for the first question, I'm going to ask Paul Anderson to respond to my question: how did national and international frameworks such as HE targets or the Sustainable Development Goals drive the indicator selection for the SOCO report or SOEC report?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Stacy. Really appreciate that, and for the question. It's a good question because indicators by their very nature are a subset of reality, so we can't talk about everything. Most Pacific Island countries have national sustainable development plans, national environment strategies, MBSAPs, National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, and NORNEMs, National Environment Management Strategies. So they have national plans and policies that they want to deliver on, they need to deliver on. Fortunately, countries in the Pacific have also been addressing the Rio Conventions, including the Convention on Biodiversity, for decades. And so many of those international targets that are the ACHI targets are embedded in their national plans. So we can, if done carefully, develop indicators that can answer those national priorities at the same time as addressing the international ones like the ACHI targets and some of the SDGs. The SDGs, fortunately, have been developed with wide consultation with countries, including the Pacific Island countries. And so many of the SDG 12, 13, 14, 17, some of 6 directly relate to the things that we in this conference really want to achieve. clean water, more protected areas that are effective, etc. So an example of one of the indicators in the current SOEC is area protected, which addresses MBSAP targets at the country level, state of environment indicator requirements, as well as SDG 14.5.1 and parts of 15.2.1, as well as ACHI target 12. And all of these, the population and gathering of data analysis for indicators is time consuming and expensive. And so the more reporting requirements we can check off with one, the better. So the short answer is the ACHI targets and SDGs were directly thought about and addressed during the development indicators, but the starting point was always the national priorities because that's what countries deliver on. Yeah, hope that's a good summary. I think that you'll find a mapping in the State of Environment and Conservation report that links those national, regional, and international targets together, so you can see how they relate. Some are perfect matches and some not quite perfect, but they're getting at the same point. Protected areas, reducing invasive species impacts, treating solid waste in a more effective and consistent manner. So I'll turn it back over to the chair now. I'm happy to take any of their questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And before I move on, I have to apologize. I forgot one of our panelist speakers because will be joining us from video, pre-recorded video, because she can't be with us today. She's based in France, and that is Anne-Sophie Archambault, who is the node manager of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, from France. So we'll hear from her later. Je suis désolée, Anne-Sophie. Okay, my next question is over to Tiffany Straza. So Tiffany, I've heard some feedback that the SOEC report does not say much in regard to the conservation nature in the Pacific is helping to achieve human well-being outcomes, including health and cultural practice. So could you talk a little bit about why is this challenging to include and how you think it might be measured?
Sure, Naka Stacey, thank you. And just a quick talofa lava to everyone. I do want to thank SPREP and the organizers and Stacey for keeping us on track in this session. And thank you to everyone listening in. The more people we have involved, the more perspectives we have involved in environmental management, that can improve what we do. And that's really at the heart of this question as well. You're absolutely right that measuring the impact of nature, the state of nature and nature management on human well-being is really challenging to measure, in part because of the huge scope. Nature has its own value, but a lot of our environmental management, and in many cases our individual connection to nature, is based on what it provides for us, those ecosystem services that go across the whole range from economic to cultural to mental health and spiritual well-being or sense of identity. So how do we measure that? My answer will be very different depending on if we're looking at the national level or at the regional level. In both cases, healthy ecosystems benefit people. But the practicalities of quantifying that or characterizing a community's own goals for their nature management in a meaningful way can differ. Just quickly at the national level, there is some really exciting work going on that will be important for environmental management, but is also important in the context of a One Health approach to both nature and human systems together. And that's, of course, coming to the forefront this year as everyone's facing our relationship with nature in the context of a pandemic. I think of the work that's being done in the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, which of course Stacey's very familiar with, to create well-being indicators. Or for an example from the North Pacific, I think of the 6 indigenous health indicators created by the Swinomish tribe. In all of those cases, the work was led at the community level, and that is essential. But it also involved local policymakers, and it was written up to form part of the peer-reviewed indexed scientific literature. So those 3 spheres, that range of people was aware of the work, included, and were able to work together with mutual respect. And I think that that is really essential. The process of indicator creation is as important, or more perhaps, than an indicator by itself. An indicator is only ever a tool. It's not an end. At the regional level or global level, we do risk oversimplifying to the point where an indicator might not be useful. There's also a major risk that if we create a well-being indicator or set of indicators and set it apart from the rest of the environmental indicators, we risk making human well-being and environmental health seem separate. So instead, at the regional level, what you'll see in this latest version of the State of Conservation and Environment in Oceania, you'll see that human well-being and human uses of ecosystem services are considered as integral across the 31 environment indicators. And that's done in recognition of our place as part of nature and our reliance on nature that extends beyond just the simple use of extractable natural resources. There's another aspect of human well-being that I think is really important to discuss, and that's the direct impact of environmental management work in the region. Who is doing this work? Who are our experts? Who is part of the environmental management workforce? We need to think about who's conducting research, who is contributing to these national or regional assessments based on indicators or not. And importantly, are there educational and career opportunities that can keep Pacifica people at the forefront of this field at the global level? Because we absolutely have species and ecosystems that are interesting at the global level. We have, in the Pacific, there are management traditions and mechanisms that are globally valuable as we're all looking for sustainable modes of living on this planet. But we have less information about that Pacific workforce. It doesn't mean we don't have the workforce, but we don't quantify that as well. So more than the state of our knowledge, this is about the state of the custodianship of our knowledge. Who will maintain this knowledge and grow this knowledge into the future? At the global level, there's an effort to identify and monitor trends in national knowledge systems and scientific workforce. That's undertaken by UNESCO, which is the global custodian agency for 2 of the SDG indicators, looking at national investment in research. They also publish the UNESCO Science Report, which comes out every 5 years. The next one's coming out early next year. That looks at science governance, or how science and scientific knowledge is managed within countries. So for example, because of that work, we know that Papua New Guinea has 36 researchers per million inhabitants. We know that 33% of researchers in Papua New Guinea are women, which is closer to equality numerically than we can say in many industrialized nations. So efforts to collect and share that information about researchers and other experts, how people are working and what people are studying to maintain or grow their knowledge, I think that can really help demonstrate to the region and to the world the kinds of Pacific expertise that countries have and want to have to manage their resources for their own well-being priorities. I hope that addresses some of the question. I'm happy to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I'm just curious if we've had any questions come in from our audience about the role of targets and indicators. And if we have, maybe one of our support staff could put them in the chat for us. And if not, we will move on to our next topic, which is about issues around information availability and quality.
Stacey, there's no questions so far.
Okay, so there's no questions so far. So we're going to move on to our next. Oh, actually, first of all, could we get some feedback on the results from the first poll question, which was how often do you refer to the results, that information SOCO, when planning new projects? We can't see it. I know those of you in the audience can probably see the poll results. People are saying all the time. Well, that's good. Some people say all the time. That's great. And we want these reports to be as useful as possible. All right, we're going to move on to the second poll question, which is, what types of data do you use most in your work for planning and decision making? With options being ecological data, biophysical data, socioeconomic data, demographic data, cultural values data, opinion polls. There may be other sorts of data, but we didn't want to make the list that long, but just tick the one that you use the most. And while you're doing that, I am going to tell you the next question that I teed up for Anne-Sophie, and we'll hear her answer over video. And that was, Based on her in-depth knowledge of Pacific data housed within the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, I asked Anne-Sophie, could she highlight for us opportunities where the information could be better used for environmental decision-making, as well as some of the limitations of the data for the Pacific? And we'll try to watch that video now.
Bonjour à tous, je me présente, je suis responsable et intégrée dans l'unité mixte des services patronales. Je dois préciser de ne pas être avec vous en direct, je le regrette. Le GBIF, formation.
Yeah, I know.
Une infrastructure de recherche.
I'm sorry. This is the quality we received. La mobilisation de ces données permet la réalisation de appuyer la prise de décision au politique. Plus de 5000 études scientifiques utilisant ces données partagées ont été recensées actuellement. Couplées à des données environnementales, elles renforcent les connaissances sur la distribution des espèces, sur le suivi des espèces exotiques envahissantes, l'impact de la concentration. Yeah, it's okay. Let's just play it in French. No worries.
Le GBIF publie chaque année une Science Review qui met en valeur les dernières études réalisées. L'édition 2020 va bientôt être publiée. Les données servent également dans la production d'indicateurs de biodiversité pour la CBD et notamment pour le suivi des objectifs d'AICHI. Cependant, bien que le nombre de données disponibles soit important, il existe encore de nombreux biais géographiques et taxonomiques, et notamment dans la zone Pacifique. C'est pourquoi, depuis 2015, le réseau GBIF a cherché à combler ces lacunes géographiques grâce au programme BID, Information sur la biodiversité pour le développement. Soutenu par une subvention de l'Union européenne, BID a pour objectif de booster la biodiversité informatique dans les Afrique subsaharienne, Caraïbes et Pacifique. Un ensemble de 63 projets financés dans les 3 régions a permis d'augmenter la disponibilité et l'utilisation des données de biodiversité dans ces régions. Pour 20 000 données à ce jour. Et ces chiffres continuent à progresser puisque la publication de données continue à arriver. Une deuxième phase du programme BID a démarré pour 2020-2023 et un nouvel appel à projet pour la zone Pacifique a été lancé afin de poursuivre les efforts réalisés dans la première phase. Cependant, la date limite pour déposer une note de concept très proche, c'est le 26 novembre. Les données mobilisées lors de la première phase ont déjà permis, par exemple, de contribuer à la publication de listes de référence pour le registre mondial des espèces introduites et envahissantes, le GRIS, pour différents pays de la région. Cela s'est fait avec l'IUCN. Les écologues, mais aussi les pouvoirs publics, peuvent ainsi avoir une meilleure idée de ce qui se passe dans leur pays, ainsi qu'une évaluation des impacts. Les données ont également aidé à définir des zones prioritaires pour la gestion des espèces envahissantes au Congo. Ce projet, je pense, sera présenté plus en détail par les collègues du SPRED. Au niveau français, un projet de compteur de la biodiversité des Outre-mer appelé Biome a été lancé en 2020 par le ministère des Outre-mer. Il est conçu pour alerter et sensibiliser à l'évolution de la biodiversité et cherche à renforcer les liens sciences-société. Les données produites et disponibles dans la région pourront aider à la création d'indicateurs, au suivi des espèces envahissantes ou à la définition d'aires protégées marines ou terrestres. Le programme BID est vraiment axé sur le transfert de compétences et le renforcement des capacités.
Plusieurs sessions de formation professionnelle ont été organisées. Le but est vraiment de faire de la formation de formateurs et d'ainsi créer de nouvelles communautés de pratiques dans les régions. Maintenant, actuellement, le SPRET, Programme régional océanien de l'environnement, et le Royaume des Tonga sont officiellement devenus membres actifs du GEDI et ils peuvent aider les chercheurs, gestionnaires et utilisateurs de la région dans leur démarche de mobilisation et d'utilisation des données. Le GEDI France contribue également, par exemple, pour la Nouvelle-Calédonie, à aider les chercheurs aussi à publier des données ou les gestionnaires de données, quelles qu'elles soient. Voilà, j'espère que ces quelques éléments vous seront utiles pour la discussion et je vous remercie de m'avoir écouté. Bonne continuation.
Okay, well, we deeply apologize to those of you who may have had challenges listening to that video. We understand that the audio is a bit soft, and so we couldn't also do the translation from French into English. But I just want to follow up because I do think that it is a very interesting and relevant question. So maybe Paul could provide a little bit of additional response about some of the opportunities where data could be better used for environmental decision-making in the Pacific, and also some of the data limitations that we have.
Thank you, Stacy. Appreciate that. And I'm sorry I can't add to the presentation because my French is not so good, and also I couldn't hear very much. But BID and GBIF are fantastic resources. SPREP now hosts a GBIF node, I believe, that we've been working with countries to upload particularly invasive species information into and other data sets, which is fantastic. Colleagues at SPC have also been using the new node at SPREP to host their species-specific information. That said, there is a ton of work to collate and pull together information, and there is a lot of good information available to inform better decision-making on conservation. However, the limitations are manifold. We have a rapidly, lots of turnover in the workforce. So our experts often depart to other locations. We have vast geographic areas. And so while we might have good information for one small part of a Pacific Island nation, it's likely that outer islands are less frequently visited. So information on them by nature of the geography will be out of date. There are some Ramsar sites in the north, which I don't think have been visited in many years. So updating our Ramsar information is challenging. So there's a bunch of things we can do. One of the key things is when information is gathered, make sure that it's used by as many people as possible and people are aware of it. Don't throw out data because there's an error in it. Write down the caveats and share the information, and we'll take the information as it is with the caveats and working on improving it. I think this group, this network is fantastic in its interest and collaborative spirit, but we can do better at reaching out to other sectors. Our colleagues in fisheries, customs, agriculture all have important and valuable information that can be used to do better conservation, and partnerships with them result in better outcomes. So we're making good steps. We're addressing some of the limitations, but there is a lot of additional work to do. Thank you for that. I hope that added something or stimulate some discussion. Back to you, Stacy.
Thanks very much, Paul. Now, Sebastian, the next question is for you. Because the Pacific is so vast and it's so expensive to collect field data, what do you see as the advantages that remote sensing technologies can offer? And where do you think are the new opportunities to use these tools to collect data to inform biodiversity conservation and resilience planning?
Well, Stacy, thank you for your earlier introduction. Besides being a GIS, an everyday GIS ninja, I'm also the technical manager of a small remote sensing company based in New Caledonia. So we know the Pacific very well. So to answer your question, I would say that when it comes to environmental management, we know that inputs, informations, data are key elements to within the decision-making process. for that reason, I really believe that remote sensing, and especially Earth observation, actually, because Earth observation is basically remote sensing, but using satellites. So Earth observation is has to be considered when designing environmental monitoring frame. I mean, it has the ability, following what Paul said earlier regarding the Pacific geography, the Earth observation, so using satellites, gives you the ability to cover very, very large areas and provide both historical and near real-time data sets at the fraction of a cost of field data collection. Well, understand me well on this question. I do believe that Earth observation is a very good tool, but it has to be used in combination with field data. It has to be used in combination with other indicators. It cannot be used on its own. But it has the ability to fill gaps and together combined with analytical tools such as GIS, Geographic Information Systems, it can provide a very powerful picture about the biodiversity and resilience planning opportunities. As an example of that, I would just give you I don't know if you've heard of this European program called Copernicus that was launched in the mid-90s, I think, and it's basically launching up a bunch of satellites. There are 6 right now, but satellites that are here to address specifically SDGs. And furthermore, I would say that the access to the data is free of charge. So it's a very good example of how we can use the tools that are at our hands to address SDGs and to help Pacific communities to address those SDGs. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Sebastian. I'm going to fire the next question over to Tiffany, and you might not have been prepared for this because I didn't tag you with your name in our session document, but I'd like to see what your thoughts are on how can we better integrate traditional knowledge in our monitoring systems while also making sure that we protect local and indigenous intellectual property.
Thank you. I think this is a huge question. It's one of the most important ones for our times, whether we're looking at a national assessment, regional, or global. And I guess maybe the first thing that I should mention is at the global level, looking at the work of IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They're basically like the IPCC of biodiversity assessments. And they have created and maintain a living document on guidance for governments on how to integrate traditional knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and database knowledge, scientific knowledge by any other term. My definition of science is pretty broad because science is a system of knowing that is fact-checked and replicable, right? And there's threads of that throughout Pacific cultures and knowledge traditions. So one of the first things we need to do is stop treating science as completely separate from all knowledge that might already be in place within a given community and a indigenous knowledge system. So there is work going on to integrate those, and it has to be predicated on respect from both sides. It has to, most importantly, it has to take time. And in order to afford that time, we have to plan proactively. This means we need to bring communities in at the design phase of projects. I think Eliki mentioned this in the earlier session on putting our people at the center of conservation. If we try to, cram a project through and then suddenly add in consultation at the end or grab people's knowledge at the end, that doesn't work, right? I think we need to be conscious of the kinds of information to share and also the kinds of information to protect. This can be a tough challenge for the work of someone like Sebastian and Jean. The literal boundaries on maps can be problematic. If we clearly indicate the location of a rare or endangered species or of a specific valuable habitat type, we can place that species or that habitat at risk along with the communities who depend on it. However, there's tremendous value in indicating that traditional knowledge and indigenous and local knowledge exists today about specific topics, even if we don't share the details of what that knowledge is. But if by recognizing that information as real, as valuable, as part of today's modern society, and as meaningful to integrate with our scientific knowledge, our economic knowledge about the system under study, then we can accord respect to the place-based people who created that knowledge, and we can demonstrate the value of this knowledge to our global heritage. I think if we don't pay that respect, we risk losing that knowledge. And that undermines, basically, if we're losing information that's gained from millennia of living alongside unique ecosystems, we undermine our chances of survival on the planet. So it's increasingly essential even in indicator-based assessments. I know that there are community groups doing this work all the way up to the global level. I think of the local and indigenous knowledge systems team at UNESCO. They published how to integrate indigenous knowledge in climate change assessments and adaptations. I know SPREP is active in this work because there's a lot of meteorological and climate knowledge that is embedded in indigenous traditions. And again, we need to respect that, in a sense, quantify that or make that visible so that we can value it and keep it alive into the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from our audience that I'd like to put out. And any of our panelists are open to answer this. So this is, how do you bridge the gap between technical experts in the community when relaying the message to stakeholders? Did everyone hear that? Did one of our panelists want to take on that question?
Stacey, I'd be happy to take it. I'm getting the French translation at the same time as
I'm hearing that too. Yeah, I'm not sure how to turn that off.
Yeah. Can you ask again? I'll pay real close attention to what you're saying.
I will ask it again. How do you bridge the gap between technical experts and the community when relaying the message to stakeholders?
I'll try. Thank you for the question. So I work at SPREP, the Secretary for the Pacific countries, and our approach is always to work through national government and through national officers who have a immediate connection with the communities they're working in. It would be much more effective to work with the people who are on the ground, already mandated by the citizens and community members to help them manage their own resources. And we've found that to be the most effective way to engage. And relaying messages, for me, it comes down to why do the community members care? And so it's important to make it real. If we're talking about climate change on a global scale and ocean acidification, it matters to people living on the coast because it affects the growth of coral reefs. And that affects the food fish and the coastal protection from storm surge. That's why they should care. And so in translating the message is figuring out who your audience is and addressing what they care about. Because we all generally care about the same things, but from different perspectives. And so I think that being able to take the perspective of our resource owners or resource users and people who are all at the ground level is really important in getting those messages across. I hope that helps. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So we're going to move on to our third topic now, which is about data platforms and tools. And again, we want to start out with a poll question. I know in the past poll question, some of you in the audience may have had some difficulty seeing it or accessing it. So I hope it will come up. The question is, have you had experience using the products from SPREP's Inform project? And the options are: 1, never heard of it; 2, you've contributed information to a portal; 3, you've searched for information on a portal; 4, you've downloaded data from a portal; or 5, you've used information from the portal for planning a project or making a decision. And as you're addressing that, I'm going to fire another question over to Paul, who can tell us a bit more about the Inform portals as well as other data platforms. So Paul, We've seen various different platforms for housing data at the national and regional levels come and go over the years. Can you talk a bit about what the Inform platform has to offer, and specifically how the information house can be best leveraged for decision making?
Thank you, Stacy. I'll do my best. So I'll start off with some of the things that Inform can offer, and then I'll touch a little bit on sustainability, because that coming and going of data platforms is a big problem because they're challenging and expensive to develop, and if they don't persist, people lose faith in them. So I have a vested interest in answering that question. I wish I could check on the poll, because the more people are using the data, the more sustainable the system is, because there's demand. So the Pacific Island countries asked SPREP some years ago to work with them to develop a couple of tools. One of them is a place to host, store, backup, publish, and share information. And that has resulted in this network of the Pacific Environment Portal Network. There's a national node in each of the 14 countries, a couple of the territories, that is public facing. Anyone can access it. The vast majority of the data is available for anyone to consume, download, make use of for reporting, for planning, to get the most value out of data as possible. We've had a limited time to grow this network, and over the last 2.5 years, our data sets that are published online for use have gone from 0 to 11,600 a couple of days ago, which is the right trajectory. In addition to this network of environment data portals, there's also an indicator reporting tool, which online and is behind a sign-in, so that's not publicly available, only useful for countries, makes those links between the indicators and the national targets, the regional targets, and their international commitments to CBD, to the SDGs, and other multilateral environmental agreements. What that tool tries to do is reduce the reporting burden on our national officers so that they can spend more time implementing and improving environmental condition and less time trying to report to these various different streams and check progress against these various different things using the same data set multiple times. In addition to that, we've been working with countries, or countries have been asking us to support them developing national state of environment reports that summarize environmental condition in a single document, so that those indicators and that analysis can be reused over time for planning, for budget allocation, for project development, and to identify problems or things that have worked well. The initial question mentioned things have come and gone. I've been at SPREP for a while now. I've seen things come and go, and some of the reasons are that well-intended projects have delivered hardware and technology to individual ministries or countries and left the maintenance of those sophisticated, complicated systems in their hands. And so as technology changes, even if the system is well maintained, there's no one there to do that translation to the next system. So I've seen a number of attempts fall over, and we've tried to take those lessons learned and apply them to this recent instance by having addressing an ongoing need, so there's demand. Because if you put up a system and no one uses it, there's no point in having it, and no one will care if it falls over. We have realized that handing over admin tasks and hardware has often resulted in things falling down. So we've consolidated admin tasks and hosting at the regional level, getting economies of scale, therefore keeping costs low, and having a single systems administrator look after the whole system. That way there's only one personnel cost as opposed to 14 or 15 different people needing to be employed to run a system. And very importantly, we've tried to pick the lowest cost option, open source software with no cost, low cost online hosting, and low personnel costs. That means that sustainability is a lot more likely. It's not guaranteed, and we haven't got the perfect solution, but our chances of, if these systems are used, sustaining them into the future are much higher. So many things to touch on. I don't know if I've got it all. I think I'll stop there, but there are some great online tools. The Network of Pacific Environment Portals is online now. Anyone in this video chat can see it, can download 98% of the data and use it today. We'd love to hear from you if you find it useful, if you think there are ways we can make it better. One thing I have to add is that at the regional level, SPREP has been working with programs, projects, and other agencies to create a pipeline of data to the country level. So our colleagues at SBC produce terrific information from multiple sectors, some of which is very relevant to our environment colleagues, and they might not have access to it. And so we've built a harvest script that pulls those data sets off the other portal and sticks it on the national portal. Same with SPREP projects. When our waste team does a national assessment of solid waste or hazardous waste, we publish that data on the national portal. So it's all in one spot. We live in a time of expanding opportunities and platforms to find information, and it's overwhelming. So we're trying through this project to consolidate as much as possible in one location for our national colleagues to make their jobs as easy as possible. Thank you very much. I'll step back, and that may have generated questions. I'll be happy to address them.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to ask Sebastian a question, then I see there an audience member has a question. I'll fire back at you, Paul. So Sebastian, for our audience members, are there specific platforms or sites that you could recommend that are good sites or platforms that archive remote sensing and GIS data?
I know two main platforms I would sit right now to use as a remote sensing data archive. The first one is from the US. I think it's from the Landsat program. If you go to the USGS website, you will find all the Landsat archive. And then the Copernicus program I was telling you about earlier is a European Union program. It has several different portals that allows you to download, to check and download all the data you want. And those are known as open hubs. And I don't have the address right now, but I don't know if I can find this out. There's if you type on Google ESA, and Copernicus program, you will end up on those platforms. And it will allow you to download a huge amount of data of optical satellites, radar satellites, and so on. So those are the two main ones, and not to mention that those ones are free, so they are good to be used.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Paul, before I fire this question back to you, our poll results are in from the Inform poll, in which you may have seen in our chat. Unfortunately, 59% of our respondents said that they've never heard of it. So hopefully through this panel, we're being able to reach out to more people and they can go check it out. On the positive side, 5% have actually used it for planning and decision making. So it's happening, it's out there. There was a question about whether you can mention a little bit about what SPREP does to ensure that you're doing checks on the data, quantitative and qualitative checks before sharing it or accepting it onto the portal.
Fantastic question. And yeah, data validation is a big issue as I've learned more and more about. So there are a couple of key points. One, the national data portals are owned and populated by the National Ministry or Department of Environment. So in their offline process, the ministry, CEO or director or designated officer will identify whether or not data is appropriate to share and at what level, whether it's public, private, or shared amongst government. At the regional level, information produced by crop agencies, UN agencies, and projects run by our partners are published when they're ready for public use, because they're already in the public domain. We republish them on the national data portals. So there's a quality check at the national level when somebody's been given a password, decides to upload a data set, they go through their internal process. And there's a quality check for regional information flowing to the data portals. That does not mean that everything that's hosted is perfect or has gone through an additional data validation step. We haven't got that built into the system because it's a wide-ranging series of data types. There are published reports, gray literature, Excel spreadsheets, GIS shape files, a wealth of information, some of which may have some issues and some of which is published and ready for consumption. We've erred on the side of making more information available as opposed to less, because we're operating in a situation of data silos in every single project, starting with a desktop review of people digging for information. We may be reaching a point where additional data validation steps is necessary with 11,000 data sets. But yeah, that's the long and the short of it is we've erred on the side of let's make more stuff available and vet the data on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to having rigorous pre-data upload processes. Thank you. Good question.
Thanks very much, Paul. In a minute, we're going to move on to our last topic, which is around data and decision making. But I just want to return to one of our audience questions that goes back to our second topic, because I think it was important. And Tiffany, I'm going to fire this question at you. How do you ensure the protection of traditional ecological knowledge? What are the ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you might not think of it at first, but it ties in with what we were just talking about data transparency and how data and information or knowledge more generally is stored. That doesn't just mean sitting on a computer somewhere. It means the person who is involved. Brains or silicon-based hardware, the same sorts of issues apply. What do we share? How do we keep something safe, even if it's not freely open? Now, there's a lot of advocacy for open science and open data, and that has been hugely valuable. But at the same time, there are risks with sharing some information. I think it's important to note that some of the Pacific countries are taking an innovative approach to this, where they are, with the assistance of entities like SPREP, their crop agencies, they are creating archives and databases of their traditional knowledge that are private. So the information is held, is stored in a safe place, whether that's digitally or in hard copy, but it's not open to anybody. It's still under the control of the community who created and maintains that system of knowledge. Speaking more broadly, I do think it goes back to respect and recognition that this kind of information is valuable, that it was built on regular, routine, repeated interactions with nature, with ecosystems, and that it comes with and is part of a place-based identity. And so it's not something that you can just put in an encyclopedia somewhere and have it be the same thing. It's a living knowledge. And in order to keep that alive, we need to figure out how it interacts with other aspects of modern life. Societies change, and it's not up for me or any other outside expert to say, this is the way you interact with your environment. This is the traditional knowledge you have to have. That's it. Put it in a box and seal it, right? We have to recognize that these are living systems. And when we talk about the sustainability of environmental management or of environmental knowledge, we have to consider the people involved, the way that they're learning, the career options that they have, the other barriers that there might be to continuing to remember and actively grow into the future in their mode, their choice of how they interact with the ecosystem. I hope that answers at least part of the question. It's complicated, guys, and that's a good thing. We don't want simplicity here. We want to recognize that complexity and look at paths through that complexity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. So we're going to do our final poll of this session on topic around data and decision making. So the question is, when you are making decisions that will affect how people use the environment or contributing recommendations to inform those decisions, if you're not the decision maker yourselves, do you feel like you have enough information to be confident about the likely outcome? And the options are never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, always, or I don't know. And for my first question on this topic, I want to go back to Paul and ask, in all of your work engaging with various Pacific Island government staff, what sort of information have they told you that they wish that they had on hand to enable them to make decisions about what areas can be protected and/or decisions about permitting for development?
Fantastic question. It's definitely an issue that we think quite a bit about. You know, there's the common requests for things like prior reports, project reports, you know, consultancies, research projects, commitments the government's made in the past, refreshing them on what it is that has to be done or they pledge to do. Excel tables, but really maps, GIS, contextual data is really important in that planning stage of protected areas, not because we need to do the traditional ecological assessment of what areas are important and what areas are not. In a lot of cases, that's been done a couple of times. But what's important is having that physical representation to talk to the traditional landowners about. So this goes back to your question to Tiffany and her answer, is that a lot of the conservation in the Pacific, the effective conservation, directly involves the people who traditionally manage the resources. And without their buy-in, the chance of success is quite low. And so to me, it seems like a lot of the information that's required by national and provincial leaders is ways to better engage with the local community. People also are keen to know how the investment's going to work out. You know, if we put money and resources into this, will it work? So case studies are great, particularly if we're in the same country or a similar community, and they can see how all the pieces fit together. And everything that's smaller and near shore or on land almost always involves communities. And so for me, what I keep coming back to is reports, maps, spreadsheets, data, very cool, particularly if it's something that the community members and the planners can meet in the middle and talk about together and work on. Yeah, so that's my short answer is better ways to engage with community, and we have those ways. There's nothing complicated about pulling out the existing map and filling in the blank spots. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. And I've just been noticing in our chat box here, there's been several comments and questions around this issue of data transparency. So Tiffany, how do you think we could encourage Pacific countries to increase data transparency, and what could we do to create a regional strategy around data transparency?
Sure, that's an easy one. Yeah, okay. So I think in order to, first off, I can't tell a country what to do, and that's not the point of this. But if we're going to share data, we need to see the benefits of sharing that data. If we've just talked about how hard it can be to get information out of this region, right? You pay to go to the outer island and do that study, and you know, there's value in that data. And so we have to recognize that the value in the data is not just the value in perhaps its sale for money, but rather that we can use it, and the data or that information, that knowledge is even more valuable with more people having access to it and using it in various ways. That doesn't just benefit the user outside, but benefits me sharing that information as well, right? And I think that we can look to some examples within the region. We can look to some examples outside of the region. I mean, at the global level, there's a push for open science. We saw with the pandemic how international collaboration and free exchange of data, it's what gave us the genome to the virus so quickly, right? It can advance scientific understanding and responsive policy and environmental management much faster than if we just act alone. That's why there is a global recommendation on open science that's being considered at the UN, United Nations level. But I think for countries to be part of that process and to participate in that, they need to have a way to contribute and to receive. They need to recognize that that is bidirectional. It's not just giving away information, but rather that we can use it, and collaborate. And so there's responsibility from the side of scientists, from the side of policymakers or people who create or use that data to include the community and include the national government in that process and make sure that it is bidirectional, make sure that it is equality driven, that it is just and fair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we're quickly running out of time. This has been a fascinating session, but I'm just going to end with one more question, and whoever wants to take this on, just raise your hand and you'll get your turn. So given all of these challenges, what do you think we need to do to better coordinate as practitioners in the Pacific, government, staff, PERT roundtable members, to give decision makers information that they need in a format that's useful and digestible enough to actually influence conservation and development practice? Paul, go ahead.
I'm sorry for taking the floor once again, but a couple of things. One is to build in communications output in any substantial work. A lot of what we produce are reports, which are kind of cool, a good way to document things, not the best way to communicate with decision makers or the public. So communication materials, pulling up the key findings and the next steps, pretty good idea. The other thing is, though, a lot of the work in the Pacific is project driven, and a well-designed project that sets up free and open access to the data produced by the project as well as the report is a really good idea, and there's nothing stopping us from writing that into every proposal. The data produced, unless it's sensitive or private, should be made and will be made publicly available to everyone to benefit from. And we've been doing that with some projects now. There's a bit of negotiation with the donors and the recipient countries, but very often it results in, yes, everything can be public because, you know, we get more value out of it. The funder gets more value, the people get more value. So we can do some structural things for new information. We can also change culture around data sharing. It's kind of nerve-wracking for people. If you're not confident your data is perfect and you let it out, then it's your fault there's a mistake. So getting comfortable with the fact that nothing's perfect, even the best data sets in the world have flaws. And if you document the caveats, it's still really useful. So policy, project development, data sharing, culture, all can change. I think we're making progress. There's plenty of more work to do. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Paul. And, you know, this comes back to our results are just in for that fourth poll question. And, you know, as you said, we're making good progress, but we still have some work to do. No one said that they always have all of the information that they need to enable decision making, but 64% of all of you said that sometimes you have what you need. So there is good information out there, and I hope that through this session that you've learned of some new places to access information and some new ideas about how to share the information. So I just want to end by thanking all of our panelists once again, as well as thanking our conference organizers and all of those working behind the scenes to make sure that this technology platform is able to work. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Stacy.